I wanted to do this whole thing like it was in the meta-narrative of The Princess Bride, of the novel, but that turned out to be a really big headache and then impossible, so instead we're just going to be doing this. The Princess Bride is a novel written back in 1973 by William Goldman. Happy 50th anniversary. Goldman's probably better known for his screenwriting. He wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, as well as All the President's Men. He wrote the screenplay for The Princess Bride as well, which was adapted into a film by Rob Reiner. I'm going to assume most of you have seen the movie, fewer of you have read the book. I'm going to be using the 30th anniversary edition, including all of the introductions and Buttercup's baby, because the narrative structure really requires it, as well as if you go to a bookstore, this is the edition you're going to get. Everyone sells the 30th anniversary edition, so I don't feel so bad about using it. See, there are 3 layers of reality we need to talk about when discussing The Princess Bride. The first we just got over. The next involves some new characters. Layer 2 reality involves a man named Bill Goldman, best known for works like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, as well as All the President's Men. He didn't write The Princess Bride. That was a novel he abridged, which was originally written by a man named S. Morgenstern. For the rest of this video, I'm just going to call the Layer 2 reality author Bill and Layer 1 Goldman. I think that's just for the sake of clarity. Layer 3 reality is, the story of the book, the one we all know and love. Fencing, fighting, torture, poison, true love, hate, so on and so forth. And I love the movie, don't get me wrong, but it cuts out so much of Layer 2, and that's a shame, right? Because I think the real soul of this novel is in Layer 2 reality, right? That's where all the interesting bits are. Because that's the bit that talks about fatherhood. And I think that's what this book's really about. It's about that father-son dynamic, and this book really wants to say something about it, and I'm trying to figure out what. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but fatherhood is a running theme through all literature, and The Princess Bride is no exception. But The Princess Bride's kind of weird because it plays its hand pretty quickly, right? It tells us what its theme is. It says right here, life is pain. Anybody who says otherwise is selling something. And I think it's trying to explain that life is pain through the lens of fatherhood. The prime father-son dynamic is between Bill and his son Jason, right? That's in Layer 2 reality. When Jason turned 10, Bill bought him a copy of The Princess Bride by S. Morgenstern, because that's when Bill's father read it to him. Bill was actually on a business trip at the time, and the disembodied voice of his father compelled him to buy a copy of the book for his son, which is kind of weird. Bill was in the middle of, flirting with a woman that wasn't his wife at the time, but this is a video about fatherhood, not about marriage. When Bill gets back from his business trip, we learn a few things, right? First, we learn Bill has never actually read The Princess Bride, only ever had it read to him by his father. 2, Jason couldn't make it through an unedited version of The Princess Bride because it was so boring. And 3, Jason's overweight, to an extreme amount. Bill literally calls him a blimp, and that causes some strife within the family, right? Jason is sad because he's overweight, and Bill keeps pressuring Jason to lose weight, but that stresses Jason out, so he eats more. Kind of a terrible cycle. And the wife, Helen, who's a child psychologist, realizes that, right? She puts it pretty clearly. When Jason chooses to be slender, he has both the intelligence and the willpower to become slender. And fathers in this novel never act out of malice. It's always out of misguided love. Because Bill's right. By the time Jason's 15, he's 300 pounds and miserable. But that's sort of Bill's fault, and he admits that. He says, I've got a fat, spoiled son, and that's my fault. This dynamic is embodied in Layer 3 reality by Fezzik and his father. Fezzik is a giant, so big he even dwarfs Andre the Giant when he's full grown. But when he was in kindergarten, he was just the size of a normal human being, which is to say the size of a man. He had to shave when he went to kindergarten. He was a big guy because he was a giant. But he didn't want to fight. He was a very kind soul, which of course means on the schoolyard he was picked on by all the little Napoleons of the world. So Fezzik's father says, you know what? You need to learn how to fight. And Fezzik's against the idea. He doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. But Fezzik's father insists. And then he learns how good Fezzik is at fighting, right? He's so strong, he can't be defeated. And so Fezzik's parents force him to become a professional fighter, absolutely against anything that Fezzik wants. That ends with Fezzik's parents dead of plague in Asia, and Fezzik entirely alone in the world, which is his greatest fear out of his numerous fears. And that wouldn't have happened if they had listened to him, right? If Fezzik had just become the natural caretaker that he desired to be, they wouldn't have died, right? And Fezzik is a great caretaker. We see this time and time again. He's a great babysitter for the baby in Buttercup's baby. He nurses Inigo back to health after a relapse into alcoholism, and he actually saves Wesley's life using an old Turkish cure for gout, which is really weird. The novel goes out of its way to promote folk medicine. It just rags on doctors the whole time. Anytime a doctor comes up, it just comes to a grinding halt. It's implied that if a doctor ever got his hands on the original king, he would die instantly. It's only miracle men that keep them alive. It's kind of bizarre how much this novel hates doctors. It's pretty late in the novel that we learn S. Morgenstern's father was a doctor. He was Dr. Max Morgenstern, married to his wife, Valerie. You know, Miracle Max and his wife, Valerie, who are characters in Layer 3 reality. It's actually really, really weird because Bill pulls us aside and says his editors wanted to remove that scene because it sounded too modern. Specifically, Max and Valerie sounded too Jewish. Bill's defense for this is that they are Jewish. You know, the guy named Simon Morgenstern isn't exactly a Gentile, and maybe the two characters based on his parents sound like an old Jewish couple because they are an old Jewish couple. If we're playing a game of stereotypes, I would say it's probably fair to say that the Jewish doctor wasn't so thrilled that his son decided to become a writer, and maybe that crops up a little bit in the son's work. Just a thought. We also see that Morgenstern gets to act as a miracle man, which is really weird, right? When Bill is in the hospital, he claims that it is only having the Princess Bride read to him that saved his life, right? Morgenstern saved a life without needing to be a doctor. So why was his dad so worried? We learn a little more about Morgenstern's father in the introduction to the 30th anniversary edition. We get a snippet of Morgenstern's journal, and he talks about this trip he took when he was a kid, and his dad took him to Denmark, to Elsinore Castle, right? That's where Hamlet is set. And the father explains to his son the story of Hamlet, another important work about fathers and sons, I might add. And it has this profound impact on Morgenstern. We only hear this tale because of its importance to the writing of The Princess Bride. Right, because The Princess Bride is history. It's a telling of real events in Layer 2 reality. Morgenstern is Florinese, as is Bill's father, right? He's a Florinese immigrant, which is why he reads The Princess Bride. The Princess Bride is the epitome of Florinese literature. And Morgenstern considered changing history, right? He wanted Inigo to fail while fighting Count Rugen, even though Inigo in history succeeded. But as Morgenstern remembers this story about Hamlet, he realizes, you know what, even in this great work about pain and revenge, Hamlet succeeds. It'd be pretty shitty to change history just to have Inigo fail. But now we get to talk about the guy you all thought of when I said the thesis of this video, right? Inigo Montoya. Inigo was 10 when his father was killed in front of him. Domingo Montoya was a swordsmith, the greatest swordsmith of all time, but he was penniless because he refused to take any commissions that were below his level. Because Domingo was an artist, and he would only work on swords that were a paradigm shift. So when a six-fingered man showed up and asked for a sword that wouldn't impair him, Domingo accepted, because that was something new. That was something great. And he worked tirelessly for a year to make the perfect sword for a six-fingered man. And when the man came to take his sword, he haggled on the price. And Domingo threw him out, right? Because Domingo was an artist. They had agreed on a price, and he wasn't going to haggle. He's not a craftsman. And the six-fingered man killed him for it. And then he scarred Inigo on either side of his face. Honestly, there's not a lot to discuss with Inigo. His dad died in front of him. That's gotta be traumatic. It's gotta impact you for the rest of your life. And how can you not hate the person that killed your dad for the rest of time? When William Goldman was 15 years old, his father took his own life. Maurice Goldman was a Jewish immigrant to America. He was a businessman who worked in textiles. but his alcoholism drove him to lose his business and then stay at home with severe depression. As Goldman says, his father was in pajamas for the last 5 years of his life. Goldman had written an essay with his father's help, and when he went back to show it to him, Goldman's the one who found his father's body. In the introduction to the 30th anniversary edition, we get a little more from Morgenstern, right, about that fight with Rugen and Inigo. Until he finally cries, "I want my father back, you son of a bitch. And when I wrote those words, I realized what I wanted most on earth that I cannot have is my own father back." But Morgenstern never wrote, "I want my father back, you son of a bitch." The line in the novel is, "I want Domingo Montoya." The line, "I want my father back," only exists within the movie, which in all layers of reality was written by William Goldman. The last line of the novel is, "Life isn't fair. It's just fairer than death, that's all. Life sucks. Life is pain, but it's better than death." At least that's what he wrote in 1973. By the 25th anniversary, I think he sounded a little more optimistic. The last line of Buttercup's Baby, the last line you're likely to read when going through this book, is, "Morgenstern has never given them an easy shot at happiness. This time, I sure hope he lets them get there." We see some optimism, because life is pain, but it's also joy, and boredom, and grief, and happiness, and fencing, fighting, torture, poison, true love, hate, revenge, giants, hunters, bad men, good men, beautiful ladies, snakes, spiders, beasts of all natures and descriptions, pain, death, brave men, coward men, strong men, chases, escapes, lies, truths, passions, miracles. The last dad we need to talk about is Bill's father, the Florinese barber, the one who read him The Prince's Bride. There's only one fault I can find with him, and he didn't force his son to be this way or that, and he didn't die tragically. He actually fell asleep in a barber's chair and passed away there. He was taking a nap. But the one problem with Bill's father is his English, because Bill only speaks English, right? So he has trouble communicating with his father. We actually see that sort of communication problem come up again and again, right? Fezzik's father only speaks in Z's, Humperdinck's father only mumbles. So fathers having trouble communicating comes up again and again in the book. And I think really, fathers only have trouble saying 3 words. I love you. And that's the trick, I think. Domingo Montoya is the only father in the original text to say I love you. In the 25th anniversary edition, we see, in Buttercup's Baby, Bill tells Jason, I love you. Remember Jason, 15 years old, 300 pounds, and miserable? It's only when Bill says, I love you, that the relationship takes a turn. And it's wonderful, right? Because it's not like Jason instantly gets better. He still has to work and struggle through it. But it's having his father say, I love you, no matter what, that really helps him through it. And Jason now feels like he can confide in his father, right? He eventually asks for an Arnold Schwarzenegger book, and Bill gets it for him, right? Because Jason feels comfortable asking. And note how Bill shows his affection, right? If we're going to use today's terms, his love language is gift giving. That comes up again and again in the novel, is Bill likes giving gifts. And that's important too. Bill says I love you by buying gifts. Bill's father says I love you by reading, because he has trouble with his own words, but he can use Morgenstern's. He's trying to say I love you. He's trying to read. He's trying to please. He's trying to keep his son alive and the wolves away. Fezzik says I love you by caring for Inigo when he relapses back into alcoholism. Inigo says I love you by playing rhyming games with Fezzik. And I think most famously is Wesley says I love you to Buttercup by saying as you wish. The last line of the original novel is that life isn't fair, it's just fairer than death. And the last line of the sequel is that we can have hope about how unfair life is. But I think it's the last line of the movie that I really enjoy. Because when the story's done and it's time to go home, the grandson just asks his granddad to come back. And Peter Falk, in a killer performance, just says, as you wish. And I think that's the lesson we need to take away from this story, in all its many forms, in all its many iterations, is that life is pain, but it's a lot of other things. And if you want to make those other things shine, it's important to say, I love you, in any way you can. Thank you. Hey, cat. Yeah, no, I'm trying to film. No, I know.